Hi, this week we'll continue our dialogue about the church's primary mission, making disciples, with Pastor Chris Goeppner. Chris is the lead pastor of Riverbank Church in White River Junction, Vermont. He's a board member of Vision New England. He's a former moderator of Vision New England. I'm Charles Gallagher, the president of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. Chris, thanks so much for being with us again.
It's my pleasure, man. Always an honor.
Hey, so for folks who maybe missed last time, can you give us a little bit of bio? How'd you wind up? How'd you start up here? I'll precede a little bit. How'd you start up here, go down to Florida, end up back here?
Yeah.
Then maybe a little bit about Riverbank Church.
Sure. So my background is I grew up in South Florida, and at, 11, 12 years old, my mom she grew up in the seacoast of New Hampshire. My dad was in the Air Force, Pease Air Force Base. She lived in Durham. They met, got married, and moved off to Florida. And then when I was 11 or 12 years old, Dad said, let's move the family up to Mom's family. And so we moved into the seacoast area and lived there for about 7 years. We ended up going to Dover High School, Dover, New Hampshire. Maybe someone listening, that's their alma. I went there and for a couple of years, ended up moving back to Florida, graduated from high school there. And that was life and home for me. That's where the Lord really kind of helped form me in my faith and in church leadership. That's where I cut my teeth on all ministry. Ended up getting married there. Everything you can do. I graduated high school there. I did all the things in Florida. And then in 2009, in the fall of 2009, Holy Spirit just started doing something in my heart. And it's like a holy discontent, it's been described as. And it was connected to this yearning, longing, and heartbreak for New England. That it's so funny, Charles. Years ago, when we left my junior year of high school, I said, I'll never go back to that place. And yet God, when I was a teenager, planted something deep within me, a burden for this region. And so in 2009, that holy discontent led to a calling to leave South Florida, a really good place for us, family, great ministry, great life, everything. And we pulled up and moved in January of 2010 and planted our church in Lebanon, New Hampshire, just across the river from where we currently have our central location. And so we've been here almost 14 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great. And what I always love about your story is you didn't just move up here by yourself. God called and convicted families to move up here with you too, to plant the church. And that's a big conviction, I think, when you see God moving in that way. Some of us are used to, well, no, Chris, you go plant, right? You're the planter. But then when he calls and convicts others to go with you, there's a real affirmation in that. And he's done great things at Lebanon Valley through you and others that are ministering there. And that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. It's been humbling, no doubt.
Well, you and I both know that Gordon MacDonald has been raising this question to ask us, and I just found out Dallas Willard was asking a very similar question years ago, is how do you know your folks are growing spiritually? Mm-hmm. And so how do you think about that, and what does it look like at Riverbank?
Yeah, well, I think for us, as you know me well, Charles, as I have an evangelistic bend and unashamed, I'm very evangelistic and have a giftedness in that area. And our church is founded and grounded and continues culturally to be a highly evangelistic church. And so when I hear that question from me, as someone comes to faith, it's that formation. Ultimately, I want to see someone grow in their faith to the place where they're also helping lead others to faith. So I think for me in our church, it's a lot of it is connected to reproducing believers. And it's been one of the great joys of my life in ministry is to be able to see that take place here in our church community, as we are now becoming generational reproducers through their, I guess, the apprenticeship of Jesus, people growing in their faith in Jesus, and then sharing that faith and reproducing. And I think that is the hallmark of a believer, isn't it? The hallmark of a believer is someone who's sharing their faith.
Speak if you will, because what we can see happen, and what we saw in some of the research, that we did a year or two ago now, is that people will make a profession of faith, and then a lot of times in a lot of churches they're kind of left on their own, and there's nothing. They may catch stuff along the way, fits and starts, and so how do you avoid that? And how do you what do you guys have in place, or what are you experimenting with or planning to help people to facilitate that continued growth? So I turn into the kind of person not just who's willing to share my faith, but that people want to listen to talk about my faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to remember that Jesus gave us some really great insights into this. When the parable of the sower is a great place for us to go to when it comes to faith and evangelism and people who are disciples. And I love that he gave us that example because they're the four soils, but he never says, well, don't sow seed on that soil. Our job is not to differentiate soil. Our job as Christians is to sow seed. Paul says, Paul's like, I sow seeds, Apollos waters the seed, and God does the growing. And that I've taught that to our church from day one, is that I think what can happen with Christians is we can get so almost consumed with helping form somebody who is all dusted up and looks prim and proper and ready to wear a tie and suit and be a deacon in our church. And that's what it looks like to be a disciple. And that's just not true. I think for us, it's about reaching people, casting seed, evangelizing. And as you begin to see growth, that growth, there's just something organically that happens relationally in a church environment. And that's what we are very tuned into, is the organic relationship. Relationship is discipleship. I love John Mark Comer, and I believe he got this from Eugene Peterson. I think it's Eugene Peterson he got it from. Was he uses apprentice as opposed to disciples, and we should be apprenticing people. And that's kind of what we have seen happen over the years as we cast the seed, evangelize. And as you know, we are unapologetically evangelistic in every environment we create. Everybody's trained in, which, by the way, the gospel is a message to be declared, not just a life to be lived. They go together. You have to live the life that matches the message, but the message is the message, right? So we preach the message. We give people the opportunity to respond. When people respond, we go and we help create pathways for them to get connected. We call it next steps. And next steps are the pathway to apprenticeship, to following Jesus. And so relationships are key to that.
Yeah. And Gordon MacDonald has been using that term frequently too, about this apprenticing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it implies an intentional effort, a relational effort, an ability that we're close enough that you can see how well I'm learning the craft and growing in my skill set. And that seems to be missing in a lot. It's certainly missing in a programmatic approach to it.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Well, here's a thought. What if it's not a program? What if it's just, I do think you and I've talked about this, the evangelical kind of machine that Western church has created. It. We almost think that discipleship is a program that you put people into, and it's just not. Now there's programming that can be a part of it,
And be
but
helpful.
discipleship is relationship, man. I mean, Jesus modeled it, right? He modeled it, and discipleship is us relating to people and again, apprenticing people in their faith. And here's what we find, Charles, is it goes back to the soils, and it's almost, I don't know, divine, the way the Lord set that up. It's like 25% of the people we see give their lives to Jesus begin to have a fruitful relationship with Jesus. It's almost to the number. And I'm not trying to say that that's the way it is. I just say we've seen that in our own space, where about 25% of the people who respond to the gospel and we help kind of foster that first step, about 25% of them go down the pathway.
Yeah.
And And that relationship is the key to that, is following through and continuing to walk the path with them.
And I think there's an important question we need to think about in this, because, one of the first times I encountered Dallas Willard's stuff is he was asking the question, what if the issues we're having in the church today are not despite what we're doing, but because of what we're doing? Which gets at that programmatic piece of it and counting attendance as opposed to transformation, and still not being close enough that we can assess things or apprentice people into something. And so there's some real thinking that needs to happen in that. And you keep going back to the parable of the sower. And what struck me in the parable of the sower after a while is that that first group is clearly not saved, right? Mm-hmm. The last group in the sower is clearly saved. And that might be your 25% of what you see who really do start to experience transformation. The other 50%, it's not clear to me, at least, what their status is. And it's not necessarily, and I don't need to try and figure it out.
Right.
Right. I think
it's just interesting, though, isn't it? It really is fascinating.
That there's going to be some segment of people who hear and accept the word that it's unclear whether they're saved to us.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And in those other two soils, I find that there's some that the seed is, falls on that soil and it's scorched by trial and pain and suffering, right? But what I have found that sometimes you'll see over time, because of maybe that initial taste and see that happened and that seed first fell on that soil, years down the road, the seed falls on the soil that's ready now. And it's interesting how it's not like the soil stays the same on people's hearts. It just doesn't. It's not like, oh, well, the seed was cast when he was 21 years old and it scorched up and burned. He's forever, no chance here. No, it's like things happen in life, and trial, suffering, pain, difficulty, wins, losses, and that soil changes over time. And we've seen that people come back into a space, the seed hits that soil and it just takes off. And so I'm just so thankful Jesus gave us that, because it gives us a hope that we should keep just casting seeds, just keep casting seeds. And I love that Paul says, hey, I cast seeds. And I feel like I'm more in the Paul vein. I'm a seed caster, but we want to have Apollos too, who's watering. And you think about those two dynamics, that's key to evangelism. And we talked about this off recording, was, the difference between evangelism and discipleship, or what is it? I was like, they're one and the same. You can't have one without the other. Discipleship is evangelism, and evangelism is discipleship. And I don't think you can separate the two.
Can you define your terms then for us on that? Because I think some of us would say, well, evangelism is the act of sharing my faith, and discipleship is the act of the effort to be transformed to be more like Jesus. And so reconcile, if you would, what you're meaning, or are you using different definitions?
No, I think the evangelism is the act of proclaiming and declaring the gospel. It is. And discipleship is the apprenticeship of someone who's following Jesus, the follower of Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, you will be sharing your faith. It's just it's biblical. It's right in here, it's what we do. We declare our faith. Paul says, woe to me if I do not declare the good news. It's just like, it's shame on me if I don't do it. Why? Because what he's done for me, I have to declare this. So that's what we do. We declare it. But a disciple, if you're truly a disciple, you're going to declare it. And watch this. If you are someone who is highly evangelistic, your heart is to see somebody grow in their faith, because the gospel is not just a message to be declared. It is a life to be lived, right? And so I think you can't separate the two. And I think we've done a good job. I think church, we talk about this in the church, we do a good job of it's almost like we create these little cylinders in our church, right? Like, this is evangelism, this is discipleship, this is, and I get it. I've led a church for a long time and understand that the silos, you want to have people leading different areas. But what we try to do is we try to integrate all of those. They're all together in that we're trying to reach people for Jesus, and we're trying to help them take their next step with Jesus. Our vision statement here at Riverbank is helping people take their next step in the rescue mission. And that's discipleship, right? And discipleship starts with evangelism. People, they begin their faith journey through being evangelized, hearing the message, and responding to that.
And so, Chris, would you say the converse is true? So you're saying that if I proclaim to be a follower of Jesus, then I am sharing my faith with other people. And is the converse true then? If I'm not sharing my faith with people, then I can't really claim to be a follower of Jesus?
I would say that you're either a really new follower of Jesus who hasn't had that discipleship yet, and that needs to happen. And it's like this: when I've heard it put this way, we're basically one bagger telling another bagger where to get bread, right? And so we found the bread of life, and so we want to share with another beggar where the bread of life is. When somebody comes to Jesus, they've been evangelized. Ultimately, they're going to recognize, I need to share this with somebody else.
Yeah.
It's not something to be sheltered. It's something to be shared. And so I would say that eventually somebody who is a disciple will be sharing their faith. They just will. If you're not sharing your faith and you say you're a disciple, I'd question whether you're really following the Jesus that I follow.
Yeah. We at least need to really think and pray about that, right? Because because if the call of a disciple is to model your life on everything Jesus did in his life, right? Memorize his teachings, right? That's the New Testament definition of what a disciple is. And so if it's to do that thing and you're not doing one of those things, right, it's hard to then claim, well, no, Jesus shared his faith pretty openly, pretty regularly, right? Talked about the gospel constantly. And so if you're not doing those things, you really have to question, I think, whether we're being disciples. And so now, Chris, you what I've always thought was so cool, and we've talked about this before too, is that you talk about the rescue mission of the church, and so you talk about rescuing people. Where does that come from? That you've adopted that language, because I think I don't think it's wrong in the least, but it's unique. It's unique.
Yeah. For us, it just comes back to the urgency that we hear throughout the epistles, and Paul and Peter, and of course through the gospels with Jesus, the urgency of his message. And when you think of urgency, you think of rescue. And so it just has stuck for us. I think the word urgency is really where it comes from for us. I did when we moved here. I remember this might be controversial for some. That's okay. When we moved here, I just remember having a conversation in my time with the Lord, and I didn't give him an ultimatum. Please don't hear that. But I just said, Lord, if we don't see people come to you and we don't see this church grow in 2 years, then I want you to know I'm out. And I didn't say that. And obviously I'm not trying to put God in his place. There's a holy reverence here. I said it out of reverence. I just said, you've called us here. We're here. And if I don't see the fruit of this labor in 2 years, then you're going to find somebody else, because and so in that, he just stirred within me this incredible urgency to share faith and to empower people in our church to share their faith. And it just became cultural in our church. Evangelism became cultural. And it was like they call it the flywheel of evangelism. It just became, next thing you know, is we just keep seeing people come to Jesus. And it's messy, which it should be, right? Because we're reaching lost people. And then the intentionality of helping people take their next step in that faith is the discipleship part of that. And again, we've seen about 25% of those people over the years really engage and take their next step in the rescue mission.
And I think it's an important point. What I've heard you say, and it is that not everybody did it the next day, right? Some people, I might have come and I sat and did nothing for 2 years, and suddenly God moved in me. And suddenly I'm plugging in and growing, because we've told the stories a lot about the people in the pandemic who, people like, I dress up pretty good when I show up at church on Sunday, and I serve and I say all the right things. But then when the pandemic came, or the election, or the violence, right, suddenly I'm a person we don't recognize as a disciple of Jesus. But then you had this other guy who's been sitting there for 10 years doing nothing, and suddenly they spoke up and stepped up, and we were shocked by how much had happened in them that wasn't obvious to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you're plugging, whenever that is that I step up to that next steps, whether it's the 10 years later or the next day, it sounds like you're plugging me in relationally with people, not just to a class where I learn. Not that that's a bad thing, but
Right.
am I reading that right?
You are. And, some people would call them classes, but we don't. We ban the word class. And the reason is I'm in an Ivy League community, and probably most listeners here have some sort of high academic influence. And I'm not anti-academic by any means. Some of my closest friends have more wallpaper than us combined 3 times over, right? But I don't want people to think that they're stepping into another academic environment. Their faith is not an academic faith. Their faith is a felt relational faith.
Yeah.
And so we've banned the word class here. We don't use it. But what we do, we have environments where people are able to get plugged into. For example, when somebody comes to faith here, we have something called Roots. And it's a real highly relational environment where there's no podium, there's no stage. It's just a room. They get pizza or lunch together, and it rotates every month. And Roots is we call it's your first next step. And so it's a faith 101 conversation with our pastors. And then from there, we help them take their next step into a group with other people and in a relationship. And from there, we want people to get plugged into serving, which honestly we would probably put serving before the group. So out of Roots, we want to get them into a group, into serving, because our serve teams are constructed highly relational. They're not, we've also banned the word volunteer. So we want to make sure people have a heart to serve like their Savior. And so getting plugged into the serve team where they're in a relationship with a group of people. And then from there, they get plugged into groups. And then there's other places. We have something called Freedom, which has become one of our premier next steps that we're encouraging people to take in their faith. And Freedom is a beautiful, really, kind of get into the depths of our soul environment where we confession is a part of it, healing, forgiveness, and it culminates with a night of worship and prayer. And that's for a big next step for newer believers to take. So there's a few, people would call them classes. They're not, but they are. Do you know what I'm saying? But we do have formal steps that we point people towards.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think they could be, in a traditional lens, people say, oh, those are discipleship classes. But I say, we ban the word class. And for us, it's just next steps. So a lot of it's language semantics.
Well, but you've hit on something that's really a differentiator between some churches as we do our work. We see is that I remember when the worship leaders, we have a group for worship leaders, and they get together every couple of months. And one of the conversations was about, how are we discipling people in the worship service? And another conversation was, how are we discipling the people who serve on the worship team? Mm-hmm. And so you can see your role in those kinds of things of, well, I just manage the greeters, right? The volunteer greeters, right? Not as, no, my job is to disciple the greeters, right?
Yeah, and that's how we've modeled it so whoever our team leaders are, they're people who have been vetted and gone through what we call leadership culture and just understand what it is to lead as a follower of Jesus and in his church, and what it looks like to lead as a follower of Jesus in this church, in the culture that we've established. And so all those who are team leaders would be disciplers. That's what they are. They're disciplers, and they bring in new people and build relationship and help point them into the next direction or the next step in their formation.
And Chris, do you have mechanisms where once a year you try and roll up the actual growth aspect? So I may be serving in a place, and that and there are people who serve for the wrong reasons or people who serve for the right reasons, but where you're determining, okay, when I look at this group of the people you've tasked me with as the greeting team lead, where you say, okay, but are people growing spiritually, getting back to that Gordon McDonald question is there a formal thing around it or not
Yeah.
as structure?
There really isn't. A lot of it is, are people reproducing, and we take notice in that, pastors and church leaders take notice in people who are reproducing, sharing their faith, inviting people to take their next step in faith. And we've tried not to, I think that can go back to what we were talking about earlier. It can become super formalized. I know I would say we're semi-formalized in that we track numbers, we track where people are, where they were last year. But it comes to a point where you're like, some people are just going to go at their pace and will let the person who's kind of mentoring them, or, their apprentice, the apprenticeship, where that's going. So we don't have a formal mechanism to track that. There are pieces of it. We know where people are, but a lot of it is relational. And as someone grows in their faith, we're able to say, hey, they probably should step into this space, and they could lead, influence other people because they've grown to this place. Now they need to step over here and they can influence others. That's through relationship, not through a tracking mechanism.
Well, I that's such an important point, I think, for people to hear, because so much of what we judge as spiritual growth and character is really just, I know how to conform well to a church environment. And so, well, Charles comes every week, so let's ask him to step into this, as opposed to, we know Charles and he shouldn't step into this, right? Or no, we've seen his character, and right, and at the stressful times we've seen how he reacts, and that's what his character really is, not how I dress up on Sundays. And so I don't think we can overstate the necessity of that relational aspect.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think if you have listeners who are church planters, that urgency thing, we need people to do the things. And so we failed early with the whole point, like, we got to build this thing. So we put people in places that they had no reason or need, or they just weren't mature enough to handle it. And it didn't work out well. And so we've gotten better at vetting through relationship, not through a formality. But for example, just recently we had 3 new team leaders go into placement, but it was through relationships, through their serving, through their roots involvement, through their groups, and just getting to know, and people who were ahead of them in that apprenticeship, that relationship, that discipleship, and then they've been empowered to do the work of ministry at a higher level. It's really cool to see. You got to be patient, though. There's a lot of patience involved compared to, hey, you've been here every week. Can you be our greet leader, our greeter leader? That's a good one, right? And so I think it just is a little bit more patience is necessary in regards to empowering people to do the work of ministry when you take this approach.
Yeah, we trip ourselves up when we get out ahead of their character, right? You and I've been in a number of conversations on this, and some of them with Gordon McDonald, and it's when that success or role comes before the character is formed, eventually that person's going to fall.
Yeah.
That's Chris. I love what you do. I love your heart for the kingdom. I love our partnership and our friendship, and I'm really grateful to you.
Well, likewise, Charles, I appreciate you. I'm so honored to be a part of Vision New England, and just a quick reason why that we became partners with Vision New England years ago, and why I've received the invitation to serve on the board is because I just have the same heartbeat of evangelism. And a lot of people don't know this. I mean, the historical roots that Vision New England has in this region are worth taking note, and being able to be a partner with that is huge, and so honored to be a part of it and know we have the same heartbeat in helping reach New England, help engage in the rescue mission here in New England, helping people take their next step with Jesus. It just runs parallel with Riverbank Church. So it's an honor.
Amen. Thanks. Some folks will still remember our old name. It's still our legal name,
Yeah,
Evangelistic Association of New England, right? It's always been about
absolutely.
people.
You know me, man. I was the advocate. Let's go back to the original name, and so yeah,
I'd still be okay with it, but not.
yeah.
It's
I
a hard
get it, man.
conversation, right?
Yeah, and look, I'm just honored to be a part.
Thanks, Chris. God bless you. And thanks for your time today.
My
I'd also
pleasure.
like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer, and our listeners. This program is created by Vision New England, who wants to help the church make disciples, do justice, and foster unity to share Jesus so that lives can be transformed or rescued. You can find more resources and donate at visionnewengland.org. And this program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, a great evangelistic organization who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.